This story is about a girl who not long ago didn't even know how much her life would change. She was lying on her bed watching another video on the internet. A young girl appeared on her screen, standing in a plank. She turned to her subscribers and told them to repeat everything clearly as she did. The girl behind the screen was saying that everyone builds their own health on their own. For example, in kendo competition, a straight back is just a base, along with a steady gaze. After that, the girl switched to another video, where some kind of competition was taking place. The trainer, who had recently shown exercises, jumped over a huge height. The audience, who were behind the screen, began to applaud and cheer for the girl. However, at that moment, the heroine suddenly started coughing violently and covered the entire screen with blood. The attacks did not stop, and it was hard for her to get air into her mouth. But soon she was finally able to calm down. Her whole arm was splattered with blood. She rolled over onto her back and breathed heavily, staring at the ceiling. In fact, she can't even remember how many months in a row she's been chortling blood. The girl at such moments even begins to think that it is time for her to retire. But she rolled over onto her other side because she felt the coughing coming to her again, and thought it would be better to read another novel than to dwell on depressing thoughts. As soon as she opened her phone, a notification immediately came to her, prompting her to watch a piece titled, "All the Minor Male Characters Are in Love." The girl was very interested in this advertisement of a new work, so she decided to read more about it. As soon as she opened the link, she immediately saw a beautiful girl on the main screen. It was actually quite tempting to her. And the title was unique in its own way, so she clicked on the button to read the first chapter because she wondered what it could be about. However, as soon as she pressed the button, she began to choke again. Her whole body shook, and she coughed up blood again. After another attack, the girl curled up on the bed and sighed heavily, thinking that she was really sick of it all. But at that moment, when she was about to return to the piece, a notification came to her asking if she wanted to recognize the real protagonist. This function was free. The girl hesitated for a few moments. She didn't know if she should find out who the real protagonist was. In fact, even though she had only skimmed through the first chapter, it still only made her more curious. So she agreed to the proposal. However, the phone just went off. She tossed it aside and realized that they must have forgotten to add a new chapter. But she didn't see the point in continuing if she was going to die anytime soon. She lay on her back again and looked up at the ceiling and thought about how nice it would be to have a normal body. One that won't need constant intakes of pills, of which there are so many that you can't even remember without a schedule. She felt her condition worsen that day. Her limbs seemed to be stiffening. The girl thought that she would probably die very soon. After a few hours, she felt as if her body was falling into an abyss. In fact, after so many years of illness, she no longer feared death, but only wished for it. And now that she was on the threshold, she wished very much that in the next life she would be given health from which she could rejoice in everyday things. But at that moment, her phone suddenly lit up and sent her a notification that she had agreed to find the true protagonist, and they begin their journey. And so after a while, the girl opened her eyes. She felt much more awake, but also unaccustomed. Then a window popped up in front of her that the system had sent her. She said hello and congratulated him on his rebirth as Roella Clement, the heroine of the book of the same name. The girl, hearing this, was surprised. She still didn't understand what was even going on. And when she read the notification from the system, she realized that she had been reincarnated into the protagonist of the story. But then the system sent her another notification that now within a year she had to find the real protagonist. But the girl didn't understand what it was all for. The system asked her that her dream was to get rid of the disease. The girl, reading this, was even alarmed. She did not expect that the system knew about it. However, it told her that if the girl could handle the errand, he would let her stay in Roella's body forever. And when the girl read it, she was overjoyed, for it was a good opportunity for her. The system said that the girl's body was weak, but not as weak as her old one. Roella didn't know if the system was lying to her, but in that moment, she realized that she would be able to try all these things that she hadn't been allowed to before, and that she had only been able to see on the internet before. Then she realized that in romantic fantasy stories, the protagonists were exactly the same, and she was sure that the protagonist would turn out to be one of the 3 or 4 actors in the heroine's entourage. She thought of meeting the one true one quickly and enjoying the benefits of her new shell. The girl gladly agreed to such an offer. However, she did not yet know what lay ahead of her, and that the novel she finds herself in has as many as a dozen minor characters who could easily turn out to be the very... And when Roella did find out about it, she was furious. She asked the system and how it would tell her to find this one. But then suddenly the system sent her a notification that if she didn't meet the deadline, she would die. When Roella heard that, she was shocked. A cold chill ran down her spine, and she questioned her system to see if it was true because she hadn't expected it. The system said I was telling the truth, and after that she asked if it was fun or a gamble. However, the girl asked her to stop with these jokes. But the system said she never messes around. Plus, she passed away in her real life, so she wouldn't lose anything if she agreed to it anyway. Roella thought for a moment, then realized that she was right after all. But when your current fate is actually in the hands of someone else, and they're ready to erase it, it's not a pleasant feeling. But then all of a sudden the system said that, of course, she would also get other additional missions periodically that she also had to fulfill. The girl was surprised and asked what it meant. The system explained that these missions must be done for the reward, and will have to maintain the level of affection with secondary young men. Roella, listening to him more carefully, realized that apparently finding the main character was not enough. It was necessary to maintain good relations with the others as well. The girl was surprised. However, she asked the system to explain it to her in more detail because she did not fully understand everything. It was explained to the girl that at the start, her level of attachment with any of the actors is 0%. Of course, there would be occasional exceptions, and so, once she reached the 80% scale, she would be able to verify who she was really up against. And speaking of which, there are penalties for failing to run errands, so the girl must be very careful and attentive. So Roella listened to all this. She asked if the rules were too harsh. At that moment, she suddenly heard someone outside the door interjecting, asking if he had heard the noise just now. The girl was very frightened. She didn't expect to meet someone from the beginning, and she didn't know what to do. However, the system sent her a clue that she didn't even have to think about it. She needed to make herself known to those around her. But Roella began to protest. She said she wasn't mentally ready yet. But the system declared the search for the protagonist open and wished her good luck with the missions. And after that, the special window where they were communicating just disappeared. She was about to say something to him when suddenly there was a knock at the door. One of the men asked if he was sure he was not imagining things, for he had heard nothing. The girl realized she'd better not give herself away, so she covered her mouth with her hand and tried to breathe as quietly as possible so she wouldn't be noticed. She began to look around nervously, wondering where she could hide. She would have time to digest the information and get a better grip on the situation. Roella was about to get off the bed when she noticed that her foot was tangled in the blanket. She didn't react in time, so she fell to the floor with a thud. The girl was not hurt. However, the sounds were loud enough for the men standing outside the door to hear them. The stranger who had first heard the sounds turned to his partner and said that he had heard them again. Then the latter also agreed. The man said with confidence that he could swear he hadn't imagined it. Then they decided not to think any longer and immediately opened the door to check what was going on. At this moment, when the girl looked at them, she saw above their heads and trouble and hearts with percentages of apparently affection. However, at this moment, it was at 0. The men were Evan Clement and Louis Clement. When the guys saw the girl, they immediately recognized her and asked if she was awake. Rowella giggled nervously, and as she said hello, she realized that she'd screwed up big time, even for a first meeting. At that point, the guys immediately went over and put her back in bed, and after that, Duke Chase Clement was summoned, as well as the doctor. Chase watched them carefully, and afterward asked the doctor how her condition was at the moment. The doctor, who had been examining the girl carefully all this time, turned to the Duke and said that she was in perfect health. He could hardly even believe she had been bedridden for a year. The guys who found the Rowella exhaled with relief. One of them even laughed and said that she was very long-lived. But Chase, hearing those words, turned to Evan, who had just said the phrase, and asked that the boy watch his language. He was very angry. The girl who was watching the whole thing thought she was surprised that Rowella hadn't woken up in a year, but their reactions were still more interesting to her. She was especially intrigued by that guy, Evan Clement, who throws around phrases so boldly. At this moment, Rowella suddenly saw that they were looking at her. So gladly she started to smile so as not to give away her face of interest. Evans, however, looked at her with some sort of even disgust. The girl didn't know why he had such a displeased look on his face, and assumed that maybe he wasn't happy that she was awake. The Duke took the girl's hands in his, and said that he really had given up hope that she would wake up from her seemingly eternal slumber. Then, looking her straight in the eye, he asked how she was feeling, and begged her to say one word, for he missed her voice so much. Rowella thought at that moment that he was good-looking after all. She couldn't believe that he was the kind of middle-aged man who was only attractive in a fantasy world. Well, then she realized that it didn't matter at all right now. She needed to answer him, and this time, to make conversation, she decided to start with a compliment. So the girl smiled and said that even though this was the first time they were seeing each other, he was still extremely charming in her opinion. Everyone present, including the doctor, was in incredible shock. They didn't understand why Rowella was saying such things. Chase looked angrily at the doctor at this point, and asked in his most menacing voice if he was calling it absolutely fine. The man immediately stammered and said that yes, he was sure she had no signs of illness, and even on examination he found nothing of the sort. Rowella could feel the tense atmosphere. She didn't know what was going on, because Chase was practically fuming with anger. However, the Duke continued to be angry with the doctor and asked why, in that case, she did not remember him at all. The doctor was almost crying. He didn't know what to answer, so he said that he could not, of course, say for sure and make such diagnoses. Rowella was at this point at a loss as to what to do. She assumed he was angry because she didn't remember him. But then, suddenly she heard a strange sound. When she opened her eyes again, she saw that right next to Chase came a notification from the system. It said he was the father. Now Rowella realized who he was. So she turned to him, calling him Papa, and said in a sweet voice that he knew how she could get it wrong. She looked at the startled doctor and Chase and assumed that it was probably all because she'd spent a long time in bed, so she didn't immediately recognize him. Luis, upon hearing the phrase, turned to his brother and asked if she had really just called him Daddy. Evan was also shocked, saying that she must have gone crazy while she was unconscious. The girl, seeing their frightened faces, didn't understand what she had done wrong again and why they were reacting this way. However, Chase stroked her head at that moment and said that she was saying that she was confused because she had slept for so long. The girl lowered her gaze and apologized to her father, saying that it was the truth. He smiled gently at his daughter and told her she didn't have to apologize. He did. He shouldn't have confused her right after waking up. Rowella immediately looked at him in surprise, and then she said that she wasn't at all, and she was fine, really fine. He smiled back at her and said he was very glad to hear that. She looked at the two guys behind her at that moment and said that she thought it would be better if she rested a little longer. They agreed and said that this was indeed the case, and added that they would leave her and still come back later. Before he left, however, Chase turned around again and bowed to the girl, thanking her for waking up after all. He was really glad, and he couldn't even contain his emotions. Roella was a little surprised. However, she still smiled and thanked him in return as well. At that moment, a memory from her past life floated before her eyes. The same phrase had been said to her then. But the girl pushed these thoughts away from her, realizing that she had absolutely no reason to remember the sad past. So when she was all alone, she got out of bed, thinking about how her affairs were now. So she was drawn into a novel she had just started reading before she died. Many people would be saddened by this news. However, the girl was overjoyed and thought it was very cool. She felt incredibly light in her whole body, as if she weighed nothing at all. Roella got up from her bed and started jumping around happily, thinking about what the system had told her was weak. However, jumping from one foot to the other, she realized that compared to the past, she was in incredible shape, ready to run a marathon even now. But then suddenly her joy was gone and the euphoria was over. She stopped, for a thought had occurred to her. The girl realized that she had absolutely no idea what the book was even about, since she had only read the prologue and the first chapter. At this point, Roella was simply furious. She thought that if she had known she was going to be in this world, she would have read as much as she could to know what was what. Chase returned to his room at that time, and the maids brought him tea. The man sat on the couch, trying to digest all the information he'd gotten that day. After another sip of hot tea, he exhaled heavily, not realizing that this had even just happened. Memories of Roella yelling at him all the time and telling him he wasn't her father began to flash before his eyes. If he was, he would have come much sooner. Before she even fell asleep for a few long moments, they were fighting. Roella kept yelling and saying that she didn't even have the ability to lower her aura. Everyone was pointing fingers at her, saying she wasn't fit for this family. In fact, Roella grew up in an orphanage until she was 5 years old and was adopted at the age of 6. She was a foster child in the Clement family, who's with Lilia at her like a native daughter. However, Roella had always rejected his tenderness and respect. Every day this heartless girl trained the servants by breaking their cups and making them clean up the shards at speed, even without mops with their bare hands. And even after she entered secular society, she could not find a place there that she liked. Remembering all of this, Chase clutched his head, for it was giving him a headache. Then the butler, who was standing nearby, suddenly turned to him and asked if he should contact the temple. But the Duke looked very serious and even upset. At one point he told the butler that it was not necessary and that he should keep it a secret for a while. Chase explained that he needed to see what the reaction would be. Butler was very surprised at such a request. However, he had no choice, so he said he would comply. The Duke at this time plunged back into his musings and realized that Roella had changed a great deal during this time. After a while, Roella settled in a bit, and in the morning the maids came in to fix her hair. They also gave her a new outfit, so she was incredibly beautiful. But while the maids were brushing her hair, one of them pulled hard suddenly, and the girl felt pain. The maid was very frightened, her hands were shaking, and she quickly began to apologize to her mistress, saying that she was incredibly guilty. Her partner was also frightened, for they were used to Roella's abuse. The maid even fell to the floor and began to worship her, asking her to be merciful just this once, and told her that it would never happen again. Roella was very surprised at this reaction of the girls. She didn't understand why they were so frightened. She immediately ran over to her and began to reassure her, telling her that it was okay. Her hair sometimes gets tangled in the brush and it was perfectly normal. She shouldn't worry so much about it. She raised the maid and asked her to calm down. The maid was surprised and without opening her eyes, apologized to her mistress. And then she thanked her, still not daring to open her eyes. Her lips trembled, and she tried not to cry again. Roella stared at her in surprise, not understanding why she was so horrified, and then assumed that it was likely that the real girl as a character had been taking out all her anger on the servants all this time. And if such a situation were to happen again to the real heroine, the maid would be in big trouble. At this point, the maid suddenly asked if that meant she wouldn't be fired. She still couldn't believe that Roella felt sorry for her. But the girl began to wipe away her tears and said that she had taken care of her for a year while she was unconscious, so firing her was out of the question. The maid couldn't believe those words until now. Before, Rowella would only look for an excuse to dismiss them, but now she was such a generous, kind, and sweet girl. But then her partner ran closer and said they were incredibly happy that Mistress had finally awakened. Rowella smiled at both of them and said that she should be the one thanking them. She was about to say something else when one of them interrupted her. The girl was surprised that the mistress was so polite to them and asked to be spoken to informally in this way. But Rowella said she was just more comfortable that way, and she thought it was the right thing to do. The maid became anxious again and asked if they had made a mistake somewhere. And when the girl saw that they were about to cry again, she immediately said not at all. She would speak much more simply and asked them not to worry. The girls immediately became very excited, and one of the maids asked, in that case, if they could finish with her training. For if they continued to talk idly, the lady would be late for her meal with His Excellency. Rowella smiled and looked at them both, and said that in that case she would count on their help. At this time a huge table was already set in the banquet hall, and the whole family sat down to eat breakfast. Various dishes could be seen on the table. There was a huge baked chicken with various spices, as well as a meat steak with potatoes. And when Rowella saw the variety of food, she couldn't believe it was all for them. She thought she was in some kind of paradise. Well, then she shifted her gaze to the two guys sitting in front of her and didn't understand what was wrong with them. Evan and Louis couldn't even look at her. But then the father suddenly spoke. He turned to the girl and said that it had been a long time since they had last gotten together, so he asked her to eat before the food got cold. Then they began their meal in complete silence. No one was going to say a word, and that made Rowella tense. This surprised the girl very much. She wasn't sure if a family dinner should be so quiet because she had imagined it very differently. So she still remembers moments from her childhood when her parents were still alive. They were always talking during meals and never stopped talking. They always had something to discuss. Rowella's memories of her former family suddenly made her feel sad, and she couldn't eat anymore. Suddenly, her father turned to her and looked at her anxiously and asked her if she had no appetite. The girl, who seemed to come back to reality, said not at all, and she was already proceeding to fill her fork with meat, thanking them for the food. In fact, it had been a long time since she'd had a steak this rare. Therefore, when she tasted it, she was beyond delighted. The girl could not even contain her emotions and said that it was simply incredible. And after that, Rowella began to quickly stuff a lot of different foods into her mouth and didn't stop. It was all so delicious to her that she couldn't even breathe. Her brothers looked at her in surprise, and the Duke was shocked at how quickly she was eating it all. But the girl didn't care. It was too delicious for her to stop. Rowella looked down at her full plate, where she'd added a few more pieces of meat, and wondered when she'd last had such a hearty meal. In fact, if you think about it that way, she couldn't eat properly because she was sick and poor all her time. Because of this, she couldn't buy any good food, but was always eating instant noodles, or, for example, things that were very cheap. When Chase watched her eat it all quickly, he smiled and told her to slow down, because he could ask for more. Rowella was shocked when she heard this. She asked if he could really do it, and when the Duke nodded, she thanked him immediately and tore a piece of leg off the chicken. The brothers who were watching her and carefully eating their steaks were shocked. One of them asked how a duchess's daughter could pounce on food like that. Another replied that surely her origin could not be hidden, and it would periodically manifest itself in such behaviors. Evan was about to say that she was definitely acting like a savage, but he didn't have time to finish the sentence because their father slammed his fist on the table. He looked angrily at his son and shouted his name loudly. He looked at his son angrily and shouted his name loudly. Evan didn't say anything to him. He just clenched his jaw in anger and lowered his gaze. He didn't dare to contradict his father, but he still didn't agree with his father's opinion. But at that moment, their conversation was interrupted by Rowella, who began coughing rapidly and gulping air through her mouth. Chase turned his attention back to her. The man, concerned, asked what was happening to her. Did he scare her and apologized for raising his voice? But Riella, coughing, finally waved her head and said that not at all. She was fine. She smiled afterward. There were meat crumbs on her face near her mouth. However, she turned to her father and said that he didn't have to worry. When Chase heard that, he melted at her words. The anger he just felt at his son was gone, because he was touched by the fact that she called him daddy. After some more time, their breakfast was over, and Rielle went back to her room. She leaned against the door and exhaled heavily, for she had eaten too much, and it was hard to stand. However, she thinks she has indigestion because of idiot Evan, who continuously watched and unnerved her the entire meal. At that moment, a maid suddenly ran up to her and looked at the mistress in surprise and asked her if she didn't taste good, why she was so sad. But the girl, laughing nervously, said that not at all. Everything was incredibly delicious. She was just a little tired or overexcited. Then the maid suggested that she take a bath to calm down and refresh herself. Riella heard this and was very surprised, and the maid said that she would even add special oils to it. It would help to get rid of fatigue and tension, and also to improve the mood, because their smells were incredible. The girl was excited by this news and said that perhaps she should try it after all. The maid immediately went to prepare a fresh and hot bath for her. Before long, Riella finally lowered herself into the water and exhaled with relief, thinking that this was just incredible. And just like her maid Penny said, she is relaxed and doesn't feel any fatigue or negative emotions. The girl thought at this point that perhaps that was the reason she had been so sleepy lately. The hot water enticed her so much that Riella plunged in, almost head to chin. In fact, before she took possession of this body, she had been a child with rather poor health since she was a baby. And at the age of 4, she was diagnosed with heart disease, and at 13, her elders divorced. So, instead of enrolling in higher education, she was always in the hospital. And in her 8 years, she then almost died because of a violent seizure, as the doctors thought. But that was not the case. Her mother almost did it with her own hands, and while she was strangling her own daughter, kept apologizing to her, saying she was sorry and it was necessary. However, the girl was saved by her father, who had just entered the room and heard strange sounds coming from there. When the man saw his wife trying to strangle his daughter, he immediately ran up and pulled her away from there, asking what she was even doing and if she was sane. However, the girl was not sorry for what she was about to do. She fell on her knees and, covering her face with her hands, asked how much longer they would put up with it. He works as a driver and still additionally earn physical labor from morning to night. However, still nothing changes. She moved closer to him and asked him how much longer they would be able to pay the hospital bills, which were increasing every day. What else could they do but this? The girl herself, who didn't understand why her own mother wanted to kill her, was lying on the bed, trying to get her breathing back to normal, and crying silently, crying after the situation. But at that moment, Riella, who was heavily immersed in her memories, noticed how she plunged into the water completely and began to gasp, swallowing it. The girl managed to react in time and dashed out of there, starting to cough up that water. For a while longer, she tried to get her breathing back to normal, and then she realized that she remembered well the days when everyone was suffering, and no one could live normally precisely because of her poor health. The girl looked at her reflection in the water and suggested that perhaps this body was her reward for the experience. Then she realized that if that was really the case, she couldn't so easily give up the chance that had been given to her. Riella realized that the fact that she was inside a novel wasn't that important. What was more important was surviving inside that very novel. At that moment, the girl remembered the system's warning, which said that if she tracked down the true protagonist before the end of the year, it would let her stay in this body, and if not, she would simply die. Riella has set herself a goal. She absolutely must find the real protagonist in a year, no matter what. She won't give up on such an incredible chance that someone has given her. Some more time has passed since that moment, and Riella is once again sitting in front of the mirror while the maids comb her hair. The girl looked at them in surprise and wondered if it was really that necessary. She didn't really like the idea because it was time-consuming. She said that she was just going to have a talk with her brother, but Penny was indignant when she heard this and asked what she meant by just a talk. This is the first time she's voluntarily gone to meet a young gentleman, not to minimize the occasion. The other maid also agreed and said that this was the first time Mistress had a chance to strengthen the brotherly bond, and that requires careful preparation. And after a fair amount of time, the maids finally finished doing her hair. Their final touch was to apply a few drops of perfume to her hair to make it smell nice. When Riella looked in the mirror, she was incredibly surprised. She had to admit that she looked just fine. She was wearing a modest but no less chic red dress, and her hair was neatly gathered. At this moment, the girl thought that this heroine must be 17 years old, yet she was surprised by how mature she looked. The maids, who were glad to have finally finished their work and pleased with the result, told Mistress that now it was her turn. Riella smiled and thanked them for their help. Penny's tears welled up at her beauty and good-naturedness. It was still hard for her to get used to how much the girl had changed. After that, Riella went straight to meet her brother. Before she knocked on the door, she thought that Luis must be better than Evan, and she really hoped that at least he would be able to talk to her normally. But just as she was about to knock on the door, she heard a voice behind her. He asked what she was doing there. Riella was very surprised. When she looked away, she saw Evan walking toward her. The girl immediately turned to him and said that she had some business to attend to with Luis, which was why she had decided to talk to him. Aroella was actually quite surprised. She realized, of course, that they were twins, but they still looked incredibly alike. The boy suddenly moved closer to her and asked if she had come to see him. The girl began to get very worried. She didn't understand what he was talking about. After all, this was Luis's room, and for some reason, Evan said she had come to see him. But she wasn't. The boy suddenly folded his arms at his sides and said, smiling, that he could listen to her. Then he asked what she had to say to him that had brought her to his room. It all made sense to Rielle now. She guessed that he was going to deceive her and take advantage of the fact that they were incredibly similar to her brother. But there's no way he can do that. She can see it. The little cat on the top of his head, where his name is written, as well as his level of sympathy. So the girl smugly turned to Evan and said she had business with her brother, not him actually. The guy was really surprised. Then he suddenly made a serious expression and asked how she could be so sure. After all, he was an exact copy of Luis, so how could she guess that it wasn't him? Riella apologized to him, after which she said she just knew it, and that was it. Evan was very surprised to hear this, and he realized that these weren't some empty words. She recognized him after all. And while the guy pondered various things and realized that this girl was the only one who could tell them apart, then Riella saw his liking go up 1%. She was so surprised that she couldn't even believe her eyes, so she began rubbing them nervously to make sure what she saw was accurate. Riella couldn't understand why his level of sympathy had risen out of the blue when she hadn't even done anything. Evan looked at her face in surprise, not knowing what she was so happy about. Evan looked at her face in surprise, wondering what she was so happy about. The guy was shocked, and Riella still kept thanking him, saying it was just incredible. Evan tried to shove her off him, as the girl clung to him and asked what she was doing. She kept hugging him, though, and said she was incredibly happy about the news. In fact, the girl still couldn't believe that she was able to increase his level of sympathy in just a couple hours, and after all, she hadn't even done anything, hadn't made any effort. But at that moment, hearing some incomprehensible noise from his room, Luis came out, asking what it was that was going on in there. But when the guy saw his brother being hugged by Riella, he was incredibly surprised. He wondered what he was doing in the first place. Evan was too embarrassed by the whole situation, so he still added some strength and pushed the girl, so she flew straight into Luis. Riella smiled awkwardly when she saw him and said hello, for he managed to catch her so the girl didn't fall to the floor. Evan was sick of all the methinks, so he turned around and was already starting to walk away, hoping no one would notice him. Riella waved goodbye and said they would see each other tomorrow. Luis, who was still under the impression of what he had seen, just stood there silent. Then the girl turned back to him, thinking she should get down to business already. Luis looked at her in surprise, not understanding why she wasn't leaving. Well, after a while, they went inside and sat down on the couch. Riella immediately took out her little notebook, in which she was going to write down various information she would learn, and asked, "What kind of food does he like?" Luis was a little surprised at such a question, and after that he began to ponder what he liked. Then the guy said that the meat must be really good for him, and then suddenly realized and asked why she was asking all this from him. The girl thought at this point that she needed to keep her friends close and her enemies even closer, and it was important to know everything about her target. So Riella said that she's actually very interested in learning more about him. After all, she already knows that she has forgotten everything, so she wants to learn a lot of new things. But Luis, when he heard what she said, was very much surprised and asked if she really wanted to know about him. The girl answered cheerfully that yes, she was very interested in what he liked to do, what pleased him, and all that sort of thing. However, the guy still didn't trust her. He wondered if she was really interested in that sort of thing and wondered why she even needed it. He still didn't understand. Riella, who was already at the ready to take notes, put the notebook aside and said it was all because he was her brother. Luis apparently wasn't very convinced by this, for he still looked at her in surprise, and for a while he just remained silent, trying to digest all the information he had heard. Then the guy turned away from her and said that she may have certainly lost her memories, but nothing had changed between them anyway. Rielle wasn't really surprised because she had been prepared for something like this. She realized, however, that the heroine must have had a bad relationship with her brothers since they were treating her that way now. But the girl thought that she couldn't just give up like that. She had to survive, so she had to fight to the very last. She asked quietly if he really wouldn't tell her anything. Luis sighed heavily and said he wouldn't, and even if he did, she'd forget it right away. So he didn't see any point in it at all. However, Riella interrupted his words at this point and said indignantly that she would remember everything, every bit of his information. She would not forget, but would put it away in her memory. Luis was very surprised at his sister's reaction and looked at her and said that it wasn't really necessary, but he was actually pleased with her reaction because she was already starting to worry about him. And apparently, she had really decided to learn something new for herself. Then he realized that he couldn't go on like this. He smacked his forehead with his hand, sighed heavily, said that he had done absolutely nothing wrong, and thought to himself that he continued to feel strange sensations from her, which he could not explain in any way. Riella realized he wasn't going to say anything, so she said in a quiet and hurt voice that she wouldn't insist and apologized for distracting him like that. Then she got up from the couch and said that she had come specifically first to see her, but thought she should have gone to Evan first. Luis, however, suddenly became anxious when he heard this phrase. He looked at his sister in surprise and wondered if she had really come to him first and not to her brother. The girl said it was all true, but realized that she should probably leave, since he didn't want to talk to her. She glanced at him, wished him a good day, and was about to walk out the door. But then suddenly he shouted and asked her to wait, and asked why she had come to him in the first place and not Evan. Riella immediately smiled, realizing that she had gotten him interested in that phrase after all, and her plan was working as it should. Then she looked straight at her brother and said that he was more benevolent than Evan after all, which was why she had come to him first. Luis suddenly felt uncomfortable at such words from the girl, but at that moment she saw that one point had been added to his sympathy scale, And when she saw his worried face and the fact that she had been awarded another point, Riella was overjoyed. She knew that this flattery would work in her favor. After a while of silence, Luis pointed to the seat beside him and motioned for her to sit down. After all, he had some free time, so he could answer her questions. The girl smiled happily at him and thought to herself that in such a case, finding the true protagonist would be absolutely no trouble at all for her, and she might even manage it ahead of time. When she sat down on the couch, Luis said he spent his time practicing, because if he got lazy, his body would lose mobility, and he'd mastered the aura 6 years ago. Riella immediately said that was incredibly cool, and then she asked him what he did if the training became too hard for him. Guy liked the way she was interested, listened to him and responded, and he said that when ball practice gets tough, he tries to sleep and recover physically. But when the girl said a word he hadn't heard before, he questioned what she meant by saying it. The girl was not confused and immediately explained that it meant something outstanding, something that was unrivaled and incredibly good. Then she started writing down all the information she had just learned, and in fact, the girl still couldn't believe that her brother was a swordmaster who possessed an aura. She looked him straight in the face and realized that this was such a lucky thing for her. She was very lucky to have a chance to get close to him. Luis, meanwhile, continued to talk about the swordsman, and Riella realized that if she got close to him and asked him to teach her the art of wielding a ball, it would be a no-brainer. In fact, according to the guy, Evan is a consummate swordsman, just one rank below swordmaster. Luis, on the other hand, is a slightly lower level. He is a high-level swordsman, however no less powerful than his brother. And the only person who holds the title of Swordmaster of the Lumen Empire is the head of the Clement family and the girl's father, Chase. House Clement possesses a squad of some of the most highly trained knights, and the best of them even became part of the Imperial Guard due to their skills. In the Lyman Empire, where power was concentrated in the hands of the Emperor, joining the Imperial Guard was much harder even than getting a star from the sky. And the position guaranteed the highest honor from the people and the king. So many people wanted to join the ranks of these knights, but many were not able to do so. Luis said that he doesn't really intend to become an Imperial Guard. He's more of a theorist than a practitioner, and he doesn't really like all that physical violence. When Rielle heard that, she was overjoyed. She said that he might have gotten into the Emperor's university and asked if he would be part of the Emperor's squad if he succeeded. But at that moment, Luis suddenly became sad. He said it was true, and Evan would probably join them. The girl saw his reaction and was very surprised. However, Luis said that in fact, you can usually only join when you reach the age of 20. However, he is already being trained in the Imperial Palace since he graduated from the academy as an extern. But the girl didn't understand why the atmosphere suddenly became so tense. So she decided to cheer up her brother and said that in that case, he would definitely do well at the academy because he was very smart. However, the guy still looked very upset and said he was nothing compared to Evan and would be in second place all the time. Also, besides being popular in the academy, in Luis's opinion, the guy was the best candidate to join the Imperial Guard. So even the vassals are supporting Evan as the next head of the family, and everyone is helping him and trying to interact with him in some way. Roella realized when she heard this that he had previously compared himself to Evan, and now it was as if he was purposely trying to downplay his successes. But he was doing a lot of things too, after all. So she decided to cheer him up again and told him that she'd heard from someone that he'd just graduated, just like Evan, and second place in the academy wasn't so bad. A lot of people didn't even have that. Luis looked at her in surprise as the girl continued to talk. She said that, when you think about it, the first and second places were theirs, and that was incredible. She turned away from the boys, saying that she felt sorry for those who had attended the academy with them. After all, they'd probably outshone everyone with their successes, and many of them might even have exhaled after they graduated. Riella said some rather clever things, and lastly added that being the heir of a family wasn't actually that easy, and he should think about how many different jobs he would need to do. She looked him straight in the eye and asked, "Does he really just want to be buried in this bureaucracy?" Luis laughed nervously and said that no, he hadn't even thought of that. Then the girl asked, "And what is the use of this popularity? After all, it is much more important to be truly loved by one person." He agreed, and summarizing, his sister told him not to compare himself to his brother in any way, even though they are twins. However, people are completely different. Luis, when he heard that speech, was shocked. He hadn't expected his sister to be so supportive. It had never happened before. But then Riella looked at him with an enthusiastic look and said she wanted to ask him one last question. The boy replied that he was willing to give her the answer. And the girl asked, could he like her even a little bit if she tried really hard? Luis hadn't expected such a question. He blushed at the situation and asked angrily what the hell this was all about. So in the end, the girl couldn't get a proper answer out of Louis. He just kicked her out of the door, saying he had a lot to do. Still, her questioning had been of some use. She'd gotten some insight into how Louis felt about Evan, and it wasn't such a waste of time after all. Afterward, Riella went back to her room and started looking at her notes. She realized that Luis probably thought of Evan as a role model. But the girl thought that if she were in his shoes, she would hate Evan because she was constantly being compared to him and told that he wasn't good enough against his brother. Well then, she thought, maybe it wasn't really like that. Maybe Luis was just leading her on by her side. She didn't know the answer for sure. Riella sighed heavily, wondering if she was even in a position to worry about others, and if she should consider her own well-being. The girl realized that she needed to find the protagonist as soon as possible and stay healthy and unharmed in this body. So she decided to write herself a special to-do list in her notebook, so she would know what she needed to do now that she was healthy. And the first item Riella wrote down was that she would eat whatever she wanted, and the second was that she would run until she was out of breath. And just like that, the girl sat up half the night with her to-do list, coming up with various tasks she would like to accomplish in this life. There were over 100 items on that list: martial arts, parkour, yoga, and she also wanted a pet. And the very last item she decided to write down was that she wanted to fly. When her list was finally complete, she looked at the notebook again. Once the girl realized that in order to accomplish all this, she needs to find the true protagonist, because otherwise she will simply die, even in this body. Suddenly, however, Riella had doubts. Would she even be able to accomplish this task in 1 year? Various negative feelings and thoughts began to come over her. But the girl pushed them away quickly enough, realizing that she shouldn't get discouraged. So she decided that she would do everything in order. She was very serious, and as she clenched her fists and looked out the window, she decided for herself that she would do her best. The next morning, the family gathered again to eat breakfast together. And, as always, there was complete silence as they ate. The brothers weren't even going to look, let alone say hello to their sister. They obviously didn't like her, so they just ate. But then suddenly, Chase looked at his daughter, who was incredibly beautifully dressed, and just about to put a piece of steak in her mouth. The man turned to her. Then Roella put the piece of meat aside and immediately looked at him and asked what he wanted. But Chase looked very concerned. He asked if she had no appetite today. The girl didn't understand why he was asking such questions, but said that he didn't and everything was very tasty. She liked it. Her father kept up. He asked, "Then why does she eat everything very carefully and slowly?" He liked the fact that she followed the rules of etiquette and was incredibly good at it, but this was not like her. Riella was silent for a while. She put the cutlery aside and said she thought she'd made a mistake the previous day. She supposed that her table etiquettes must have been forgotten along with the rest of her memories. Even so, she was still the adopted daughter of House Clement. So the girl looked straight at her father and, smiling, said that she wanted to become someone worthy of the clan to which she belonged, and so she would make every possible effort. When the brothers heard this phrase, they were incredibly surprised that they even raised their gaze and looked at their sister. At that moment, the girl received a notification that she had gotten another sympathy each from Evan and Luis. Apparently, they really liked this revelation from Riella. However, the servants who stood on either side were also surprised. However, many were happy that she had finally accepted who she was for the time being. But despite the sympathy of the brothers, they still didn't fully trust the girl and assumed that she must be up to something, because there was no reason for her to behave like this anymore. Then suddenly Chase smiled and told his daughter that this was an incredibly good and smart idea. Roella smiled and thanked him for his praise, but at this moment she herself was furious, because she really hoped that this way she would be able to eat properly, because quite a lot of very tasty and appetizing dishes had been prepared. Then the girl picked up her cutlery and suggested that it would probably be okay if she kept eating, but not as fast as that time. But then Chase turned to her and said he wanted to give her something. Roella looked at him in surprise and asked why he'd suddenly decided to give her a gift. The man explained that there was a lot of common sense in what she said, so she should be encouraged, and asked what she would like to get. He said it could be some kind of wish, such as— When the girl heard this, she glowed. She had many wishes, and she did not know what to ask for. Roella thought about asking for comfortable clothes since she was going to exercise, or going for a run until she was out of breath in the domain. However, Chase at that moment clarified one very important thing, that whatever wish she made, it was strictly forbidden to leave the mansion. The girl, hearing this, was incredibly surprised. She now felt as if she were trapped in a cage. But her father smiled and said that she had lost her memory after all, so she shouldn't go out of the manor for a while until she had finally recovered. Roella realized that she felt a little uncomfortable about it. However, she still agreed with her father and replied that she didn't have any business outside the house anyway, so it wasn't a big deal. He said that was very good and asked her to think about her request, and when she was ready, she told him. Some more time passed from that moment, and the girl met her father in the living room. He brought another guest and asked her to say hello to the daughter of Twyla's house. This stranger's name was Lady Isabella, and he explained that she would be the one to teach her etiquette as well as supervise her classes. When the girl saw her, she took her breath away, for Isabella was incredibly beautiful. Roella, however, was not confused. She bowed and said it was an honor to meet her and introduced herself. The lady was a little surprised at this gesture of the girl, but then she also curtsied and said that the feeling was mutual, and gave her name. Roella, who had been watching closely at her actions, was surprised. After all, her aristocratic appearance was visible to the naked eye, and this greeting properly was nothing to even pick on. The girl, despite the fact that she had not yet learned anything from Isabella, was already convinced that she was a very good teacher. But then my father suddenly spoke up and said, smiling, that they had quite a close relationship with the Twilly family. So it would be nice if they could get closer. Roella smiled at her father and said that of course everything would be fine. Isabella was not as pleased, but also agreed with His Majesty. At this point the man stood up and said that he thought an old man like him should keep the lady from them. So he said they could talk in privacy and discuss all the nuances. As the door slammed shut, the girl looked at Isabella and said, smiling, that she was already looking forward to their class. Isabella was then very surprised and said that it did turn out, after all, that the rumors about her lost memory were indeed true. The girl was a little surprised that she had reacted that way. However, she said that they were indeed true. The teacher then suddenly realized her mistake and apologized, saying that she had been rude in her surprise, but Riella said it was no big deal. To be honest, she would be interested to know something herself. Then the girl asked Isabella if they had been close before her loss of memory and consciousness. When she heard this, she was very surprised and even embarrassed. She took her eyes off the girl and said she would explain everything to her in order. Isabella suggested that she should probably talk about the 4 main families. There are actually 4 aristocratic families in the Lyman Empire. Rod Clement from epitomizes unwavering fighting power and strength that is second only to the emperor. And the Twilly family, to which Isabella belongs, is famous for generations of academics and medical experts. However, there is also the Vollier family, who stood by the emperor and won his trust during the founding of the empire. And the most recent is the Hagiv clan. It settled on fertile land and developed its breadbasket. Therefore, among all these families, the Clement house and the Twiley house have always maintained fairly close interactions with each other. And all this because descendants of the Twiley family took it upon themselves to treat the knights of House Clement, who were injured during the founding of the nation. And unlike other healing magic, the one used by Isabella's family is emerald or azure in color. It is also famous throughout the empire for its exceptional effectiveness. And together with the military might of the Clement family and the support of the Twiley family, the previous emperor was finally able to successfully complete the process of establishing an empire. And this unbreakable union of the two families has lasted to this day. When Isabella finished her story, they were silent for a while. Rowella, who was trying to comprehend all the information she had heard, said that now she understood everything. Then the girl thought about the fact that after Isabella's explanation, she thought she understood the main motive of the narrative, including what she hadn't read about. And at that moment she looked at Isabella and realized that this girl would be a fantastic mentor. But then suddenly the girl said that they weren't really particularly close, because Rowella made occasional appearances in high places. Then she replied that she understood now, and thought to herself that Rowella was indeed fastidious and was not going to accept her fate. But it was all the same to her. It was incredible that Isabella remained kind to her in spite of it all, and the girl thought she could learn a great deal under her patronage. But then suddenly, Isabella looked out the window and saw that the sun was already beginning to set. Over the horizon, the girl said that the time had flown by so quickly, and it was already time for her to go. Roll smiled at her goodbye and said she was still thankful for their meeting, calling the girl teacher. When Isabella heard this, she straight up froze in place. She had not expected to hear such a thing. The girl suddenly became anxious and asked, "Is it really indecent?" But the girl was so excited that she even blushed with joy. She asked, "Is the girl seriously calling me a teacher? After all, I am not worthy to be called that." However, Rowella objected and said that she was teaching her after all, so she should call the girl teacher. It was the right thing to do, she thought. She took her hand and said she looked forward to their future classes, calling her teacher again. Isabella was still uncomfortable, and she said she couldn't even believe that the girl considered her mentor. However, she was insanely grateful for it. But at that moment, she suddenly pulled her hand out and remembered one thing she wanted to ask. Isabella looked straight at the girl and asked if she could ask to see Kai. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised and asked who else Kai was. Then the teacher explained that it was her younger brother, who was very worried about her. Rowella wondered who he even was, then suggested that perhaps he was another likely protagonist she could use to stay in this world. Then she changed her question and asked, "Does Isabella really have a younger brother?" After all, she didn't know that. However, the teacher was surprised at such a question, and then as if she remembered that the girl had amnesia, explaining that Kai was her younger brother. When Rowella heard this, she was overjoyed. She knew it, so she assumed that he would be a prime candidate for the main character. So she replied to the teacher that she should meet him after all, and then suddenly remembered one very important detail. The girl has completely forgotten that she can't leave the estate. That's why she has no way to realize her plan. But she said nothing to Isabella, and when she saw her worried face, she asked her what was wrong. Rowella replied that it was nothing much. She decided that she was going away to get to this meeting. Then the teacher went to the door and said that in that case she would leave, and after saying goodbye, she smiled and said that they would see each other next time. When the door closed, Isabella stood on the other side for a while with a goofy smile. And after that, the girl set off, thinking about the fact that when she had been entrusted by her father to train Lady Rowella, she had been incredibly nervous about it. It was because they always passed each other without even noticing each other. It was Roella who didn't want to take the initiative in this interaction. But on this day, the lady was so friendly that she even felt like she was facing a completely different person. So Isabella suggested that perhaps she could get close to her. She walked farther and farther toward the exit, replaying their conversation in her head, and remembered how the girl had called her teacher. A smile came back to her face, for she had never thought of such a thing. But then suddenly, Isabella's memories came back to one not-so-pleasant moment 10 years ago, when she was just a child and came into her father's study. He then suddenly started yelling at her, asking what good would come from a job that wasn't even valued in society. He pointed his finger at his daughter and asked, "Doesn't she realize that she's wasting her natural talent on absolutely useless things?" But Isabella had a dream. She began to wipe away the tears that had suddenly come to her eyes and said that she really wanted to be a teacher. However, her father kept interrupting her and told her that he didn't want to hear anymore. After all, she knows that their family passes medical knowledge from generation to generation, so she should not be the exception. Then he looked at his daughter with the stern look that only a father can look at, and said that if he ever heard of it again, he would remove her from the family register. When Isabella remembered that, she felt a chill run down her spine. In fact, her father had never raised his voice at her, but that was the first time he had ever yelled at her, and at that moment, she had to give up her dream of becoming a teacher. So she decided to pursue medicine at the University of the Lumen Empire. However, the girl at this moment was absolutely sure that no one else would call her teacher, so there was nothing for her to hope for. With these thoughts, she went to her home. And at this moment, Roella came to her father, who was in his study. He asked his daughter how her first lesson with Lady Isabella had gone. The girl was very emotional and, with a smile on her face, said that she was perfect in everything and really hopes to be like her one day. Roella said that the teacher explained to her the history of the Lumen Empire, as well as the status of House Clement. So she is now even more proud to be part of this family. Chase, listening to his daughter's happy stories, was happy for her too, and said she must have really enjoyed it, so he's at peace. The daughter said that of course she enjoyed it very much, and Lady Isabella was quite interesting and explained everything to her that was not clear. The man took his cup of tea and said that she had wanted to teach long enough. Duke Twile, however, had his doubts about that. When Roella heard this, she was very much surprised and asked, why did he doubt it? After all, she's doing so well. And the girl was sure that she would make a great teacher. Chase explained that Lady Isabella has a great talent for medicine, which is why she is studying the field at university. But Roella at that moment remembered Isabella's face as she explained and showed her something, and the girl said she was immensely happy during their classes, so she hopes Isabella also enjoys medicine, because in teaching she just shone. Chase was a little surprised by this statement from his daughter, so he remained silent for a while. And after that, he turned to his daughter and asked her what she would choose if she were her daughter, something worthwhile or something she liked. Roella was a little surprised at the question, so she could not answer it at once. After thinking for a while, she said that of course she had chosen what she liked, because it was very important. Her father smiled when he heard that, and he suddenly wondered why she had made that particular choice. The girl replied that she might not like what she was good at, but if there was something she was good at, she would soon become the best at it and become quite successful at it. When Chase and the butler heard this, they were shocked. They hadn't expected to hear such intelligent thoughts from Roella. The butler, turning to Duke Gunaha, said that the girl had settled down and grown up after all. Roella was surprised at her father's reaction. In fact, she just wanted permission to leave the mansion, but she decided not to disturb the cozy atmosphere that had formed. They were silent for a while. And then the girl stood up and, bowing, realized that it was time for her to call it a day. So she told her father that she would go to her room.